Good Shabbos. This week we read two Parshios, Behar and Bechukaisai, which finishes off the book of Vayikra. And in the beginning of Parshas Behar, we have a lot of laws about Shemitah, about the seventh year, and Yovel, and the Jubilee year, which seem to be sort of arcane laws which have no relevance today. And some people who will read this and they'll just sort of doze off as the Torah is being read. I think if you pay attention to it and try to understand the motivations behind the commandments, you see that there's a lot of relevance to how we create a society even in our day. So let's go through some of the laws. First of all, we have the law of Shvius, of the seventh year. And the seventh year, as most people know, the land is supposed to lay fallow. Also, there's another law which is not said in this week's parsha, but another place which says in the seventh year, all loans are forgiven. That's the law of Shvius, of the seventh year. Now, the Jubilee year, which is the 50th year of a cycle, there's a 50-year cycle, 7 times 7 plus the 1, which is the 50th year. In the 50th year, two things happen. First of all land that was sold during that time goes back to its original owners of the Jubilee year. And there's anyone who became a slave, a Jewish slave to a Jewish owner, would go free in the Jubilee year. Generally, the laws of a slave are somewhat like this, that for the first, when he first sells himself, he's a slave for 6 years. And let's assume most of the time the slavery would be because the person's impoverished. It could also be because he stole and he couldn't pay back. But let's say he's poor and therefore he needed to have work and someone to support him, he would sell himself into slavery. After 6 years, he would go free, but he could choose to continue his slavery until the Jubilee year if he performs a certain ritual. And the Jubilee year, no matter what, he goes free. And even if the Jubilee year happens in the middle of his 6-year cycle, his original 6 years, he also goes free. There's also some other laws about buying and selling houses. So first of all, when you sell land, even though it goes back to the original owners after 50 years, you also could redeem it. You or a close relative could redeem it before the 50 years, but not for the first 2 years. The first 2 years, the sale is somewhat, you can't touch it. And then after those 2 years, you could redeem it. If you buy or if you sell a house, so if you sell a house in a unwalled city, which is similar to the fields, it's in an area where there's fields, you're allowed to purchase back and redeem your house immediately up until the Yovel period. And the Yovel period, it goes back, the Jubilee period goes back just like the field. And if you buy it in a walled city, you have 1 year to redeem it. And if you don't redeem it in that year, then it becomes a permanent sale and it does not revert back to the original owner in the Jubilee year. And if it's a city which is owned by the Levium, by the tribe of Levi, which didn't have land, they're allowed to always redeem their house or the land which is associated with that city. There's a couple thousand cubits of land around there which are fields which belong to the city. They could redeem it, and if you whatever you redeem, whatever is in the city of the Levium always really belongs to the Levium. They could always get it back, and it goes back at Yovel. It goes back at the Jubilee year, and they could redeem it. So there's really more of a permanence in those cities that it belongs to the tribe of Levi, and that could be very simply understood because the tribe of Levi had no land. This was the only thing they had. They were not given any land. They're supposed to survive off of the Meiser, the tithes, and the Kohanim off the Truma, off the special gifts that the Kohanim got, and they really had no place to live. And in the Torah later on, it says that the Jews were asked to grant these 48 cities to the tribe of Levi, so they had a place to live, and that's the only place they had to live. Let's go back and try to understand what the motivation is behind these laws and what kind of a society it does create. So first of all, Rabbi Hirsch, Samson Farrell Hirsch, says that what this is also doing is creating an agricultural society, that when the land goes back after every 50 years, it will revert back generally to its first use. And the cities would be contained. The cities were always going to remain cities that the tribe of Levi or others had, and therefore it's always going to be those areas which are built up. And the other land you cannot build up, because if you want to be a developer and build houses, you're going to lose it after 50 years. So it would normally stay as agricultural land. And therefore he says what the Torah was trying to do was make sure that Israel remained an agricultural society. That's one interpretation of this parsha, of this portion, of this section of the Torah, and it's somewhat debatable. But I want to focus on another aspect of these laws. And if you think about it, what it's really trying to do is tell us how we should treat society. What happens generally is there are some people, we're talking about an agricultural society. So again, we don't necessarily live in an agricultural society, but the same ideas and the same the motivational factors would still exist in how we treat our brethren. So if you live in an agricultural society, your source of income are your fields. And there's always going to be someone, just like in business, some who are going to be successful and some are going to fail. The people who fail will be the ones who, number one, will have to sell their land. And if they're still not successful and they don't have enough funds, they'll have to sell themselves into slavery. So you'll end up having a lower class. It's almost like the serfs and that kind of system that existed in the medieval times, where there was a couple of a very few landowners, and everybody else lived on the lord's land, and they might have had a kind of system where they paid a tribute, or they gave a certain percentage of what they earned or what they grew to the landowners, but they never were really secure and never had any permanence in their land. It was never their land, and that would go on for generations and for generations. So that's what would normally happen in a society. But what the Torah might be trying to do is saying, hey, we need corrections every once in a while. So first of all, we need corrections in the seventh year. In the seventh year, you have to realize that you have to leave your land lay fallow. It's not just letting your land lay fallow. It's also that the land is open to anyone to take whatever is on it. You can't control that land. So it's showing that we have a responsibility to the rest of society. Even though you might be very successful in how you developed your farmland, every seventh year, it's very similar to the laws of giving maser, tithes to the tribe of Levi. There's also tithes which are given every third year to poor people. Here it's a system we're saying that at the end of 7 years, at the end of every 6 years, in the seventh year, the land lays fallow and everyone can take it. So it's not necessarily a redistribution of the land, but it's a recognition that there's poverty there and that you have to realize that you have to share. Now, is that going to help a person for those 6 years that's going through hunger? Not necessarily, but it lays down the groundwork for really who controls the land and whose land it really is. And it's saying the land is not yours, as it says later at one point in this parsha. It says, Ki li kol haaretz, the land belongs to me, to God, referring to. And therefore you can't sell it, Litzmises, you can't sell it with permanence. It's not really yours. And you're only, in a sense, you're only holding it for God, and you're holding it for the community, and therefore you're responsible to the rest of the community, and you have to allow it to lay fallow. But maybe more importantly, at the 50th year, there's really what you call land redistribution. What it's doing is it's saying all the land which is acquired by these wealthy people who are very successful, and they want to establish themselves, and they become the sort of the 1% of the country. You're never going to be able to get out of poverty if you're not in that 1%. As we know today, the problem is the distance between the rich, the wealthy, and the poor become greater and greater. They accumulate more and more wealth, and the poor people are never going to have the opportunity to move out of that the impoverished class. So every 50 years, it redistributes lands, which is, in a sense, really interesting because it's somewhat like a generation or two. It's giving time for people who are successful and maybe were more careful with their investments and how they grew the land, how they grew produce on their land, and it allowed them to accumulate wealth. But there's an end to it. After 50 years, you say, okay, now give everyone else a chance. You accumulated wealth. You don't have to become a billionaire. You could remain a millionaire and let the people who have nothing have another chance. Will they be successful? We'll see. But give them another chance. and therefore everyone has the ability to come back to a position where they now could be independent. And therefore, the same thing with slavery. At the end of 50 years, we say it's called a krasem drar ba'aretz l'chol yeshveh, called out freedom in the land for all its inhabitants. This is actually written on the Liberty Bell in the United States in Philadelphia. And the idea is that we're saying that, okay, you're impoverished, you need to enslave yourself and work as a, let's say, call it an indentured servant for those 40 years or 49 years. But at that point, you go free. And again, that's almost the life of a person. But remember that the children would also end up being in that situation. So it gives a chance for a family every once in a while to come out of that poverty and to get back. So you get back your land, you get back your freedom, and all of a sudden now there's a chance of having a society which there's some sense of equality. And the same thing is true with the houses now. The houses, it's saying that, listen, if you sell your house, you have a chance to redeem it in the first year because, okay, there's sort of like buyer or seller's remorse, and you have a right to purchase that land back. But if you sold it in a walled city, at that point, that's not your ancestral land. The ancestral land is the agricultural land. So if you sold it, you have a year to get it back. If you didn't get it back, it's gone for good. But if it's in your ancestral land, in the agricultural part, that land is part of how you're going to survive and live and work the land. And therefore, it goes back at the end of 50 years. But if you're in the tribe of Levi, as I mentioned before, if you're in that tribe, then you have no other place to go, and therefore you always have the ability to get that land back. So what the Torah here, I think, is doing very simply is it's telling us what kind of system of government we have. Are you communist? Do you allow everyone, do we say everyone is always equal all the time? Or do we see ourselves as being a capitalist society? So I think it's clear when you read the Torah that the Torah envisions a capitalist society where people have the ability to accumulate wealth, to work on their own. You don't work for somebody else, and you have the ability to become wealthy. But the Torah is saying there's a limit to that. There's a recognition, understanding that we have to share. And therefore, one of the other laws that is in this parsha is that when you lend money, you shouldn't lend on interest. Now, of course, in a society that the economy runs on lending money, the rabbis have made a workaround for this, which is another whole discussion. But the very basic idea is that we want people to get another chance. So therefore, if you lend money in a society which is the economy is really agricultural and it's not financial, you have the ability to get out of debt, right? If you're not constantly paying interest, you have a chance to get out of debt. So we're trying to create a society to say, hey, you have an obligation to the rest of society. We want to have a balance between, we want to have capitalism, we want to have the ability for people to be independent and to be motivated to earn money, but we also want you to have responsibility. Therefore, we say, for example, one of the laws that we have, it's not clear in the Torah, is to give tzedakah, give charity. It says to give charity, but to give charity up to a tenth. In other words, you don't have to give 50% of your wealth away. You have to give 10% of your wealth away because that's enough to share that you could still retain whatever is necessary for you to accumulate enough money to survive and to live and to make sure that you have enough for your family. But it's also, there's a responsibility to give to others. And as a result, what we've done is we've created this balance. There's a sense of we're capitalists, but we have to, it's what you call socialism. And it's a way of redistributing wealth instead of just having a welfare society, which could also be a product of this. And as this way of thinking, the society that we have today might be an outgrowth of it, where we say, of course, we allow you to attain wealth, but we make sure that those that are poor are always taken care of. And perhaps the way we do it today with welfare and unemployment and Medicare and universal health coverage might be actually a more successful way to get to this point. But in the ancient society, this, I think, was somewhat of an advanced approach to saying, hey, we have a commitment, we have an obligation to the rest of society, not to take interest, to make sure that in the seventh year food is available to everybody. And it creates, it ingrains within people this notion that you're supposed to help people. So therefore, you won't go the first 6 years and be the stingy person who never gives a charity, never helps anybody out, right? The Torah goes out of its way to say, make sure that even though, if I failed to mention, loans are forgiven at the end. I did mention at the beginning, loans are forgiven at the end of the seventh year. The Torah says, but don't hold back and say, I'm not going to loan I'm not going to loan money before the seventh year because I'll lose it. In other words, it's trying to make sure that you should loan people money. You shouldn't necessarily take interest. You shouldn't necessarily try to take advantage of people. And eventually we create a just society which, in a sense, recognizes individuality, but understands the need to have communal obligations. And hopefully, with that in mind, we could move forward in our own society today and apply the same ideas, even if it's in a different fashion. The only thing I'd like to end off today is the Haftarah. The last few words of the Haftarah, I think, are very applicable to the situation we find ourselves today. And it says, Rafa'eni Hashem ve'erafeh, heal me, Hashem, heal me, God, and I will be healed. Hoshe'eni vivasheya, and save me and I will be saved, because for you are my praise. And there's a sort of a prayer to God, and that's where we get one of the prayers in our Shemona Esrei. Instead of Rafa'eni, in the singular we say Rafa'enu, God should heal us. And I guess my hope and prayer is that the healing should come soon, that we should see an end to this pandemic which we are living through now, and we'll come back to society where that communal obligation and recognition of the community need will be stronger than ever, as it is really right now. We see that people are taking care of each other and understand that you can't live on an island, you can't live by yourself, you have to live as part of a community. Even though we're isolated, we become part of a community. We have to continue in that way, and hopefully we'll see an end to the pandemic, we'll see an end to the isolation, and we'll come back to a time when we live in peace as one community. Good Shabbos.